Thank you everybody for joining us today to talk about best practices in developing requirements for SharePoint projects. And for those that don't know me, my name is Dux Raymond Sai. Feel free to call me Dux. And I've been working with SharePoint for quite some time now. I started back in late 2000, early 2001. And I come from a heavy technical background, but most of my work lately revolves around managing SharePoint projects, and certainly I'll be sharing a lot of great tips and practical ideas with you. And as you know, some of you might know, for those having experience working with SharePoint projects, is a lot of times why SharePoint projects fail has nothing to do with SharePoint, has nothing to do with technology. In a recent study that came out by AIIM, pretty much the conclusion is a lot of SharePoint implementations fail because poor strategic planning, poor project management planning, no requirements gathering. A lot of it is just haphazard. SharePoint was just dropped in and people didn't care for it. So what we're going to do is look at some of the best practices, and I'm going to give you a lot of great tips and resources so you can really benefit from deploying SharePoint. All right? So to get this started, I want to make sure, can everybody hear me? If you can hear me just fine, just drop a quick note on the chat room. Say, yeah, you're coming in loud and clear. You sound like a DJ, whatever. Okay? So if you can hear me just fine. Okay, great. Thank you. So before we get started, to put things in the right perspective, tell me in the chat room, okay? Let me go back on the button. 1 second. Okay, let's do this again. So in the chat room, tell me, what does this mean? Any ideas? What do these numbers mean? Phone number? Carol, actually, that was a different number. You know that song, 8675? No, it's not it. You have a sequence of numbers. Hey, Tony, welcome. Nothing. Catherine says nothing. Okay. Well, good. So if I ask you that same question on this next slide, all right, what does this mean? Hey, Patrick, welcome. So what does this mean? Tell me, what's SharePoint? Collaboration. What else? Somebody is going to type reporting. Somebody's going to type document management. And friends, that is the biggest problem of deploying SharePoint. Because as some of you know, or some of you might not know, SharePoint is everything, nothing, something. Long and short of it, it depends. And the problem in a lot of SharePoint deployments is that we just throw this thing out there and say, okay, we're going to roll out SharePoint. Now, just by saying that, it may mean one thing to one person, another thing to another group, yet it might not mean anything to somebody. So the key is you got to put this in the right perspective and make sure everybody's looking at it the same way. So I want to make sure that we're looking at these numbers the same way. You know what these numbers mean? If you look at these numbers and spell it out, they're actually organized in alphabetical order. Yeah, look at it. 8, 5, 4, 9, 1, 7, 6, 3, 2, and 0. Now it means something. Y'all with me? So my point being is, that is one of the biggest challenges with this wonderful technology. Is people don't stop and put it in the right perspective. What does SharePoint mean for us in my organization? What does SharePoint mean for this project? And throughout this presentation, we'll talk about the best practices and how you put solid meaning into what SharePoint projects are. And the way you do that is properly developing requirements. In addition, what we're going to learn and do is we're going to talk about why having a well-defined business case is necessary. It's not optional, it's necessary to effectively initiate requirements gathering. And then second, we'll also look at what are the key components of requirements development and requirements gathering process. And then last but not the least, we're going to look at why requirements traceability is paramount in defining the return on investment in SharePoint projects. Now, it's funny, just some of these words and acronyms here, people might raise their eyebrows and say, okay, Dux, you're going all management on me again. You talk about ROI, traceability, but really, you know, I want to see those things working in some practical manner, and you'll get to see that, okay? Quick background, again, my name is Dux Raymond Sai. Feel free to call me Dux. My organization is called Innovative E. We're based out of DC and Atlanta, and we have a Asian presence in Sri Lanka. And we really focus on helping organizations leverage the full benefits of SharePoint to their business. I wrote the book SharePoint for Project Management, as Catherine mentioned, and that's my contact information. Feel free to connect with me through those different mediums. And at the bottom, you see my Twitter handle and the hashtag for this presentation, and you'll see those throughout the remainder of the slides. Okay, so for our agenda in this session, we're going to talk about what requirements are, why SharePoint requirements are somewhat special, and we're going to go through a process that I go through in my practice as we develop requirements for SharePoint projects we engage in, and then we'll open up the floor for Q&A. And certainly, feel free to be interactive, tweet, chat in the chat room. I'll be more than happy to address questions you might have or comments you might have as we go along. Okay? All right. So, first question. Why are requirements so difficult? Tell me. Any ideas? Why are requirements so difficult? Okay, so I see a couple people typing there. All right, I'll give you a few more. It's unstable. Very good. And Charlie, I suspect when you're describing unstable is it changes, right? People don't know what they want in detail. Absolutely. And there's many stakeholders because it's everything. Users don't know what they want. And Tina, you raise a great point. I used to say that a lot because I used to run an IT organization. And when we deliver something, users don't like it, I'll say, you don't know what you want. But you know what? I realize now it's my job to help them figure out what they want. So requirements are hard. However, it can be done, and it must be done to be successful in any project, much less SharePoint projects. So let's talk about this. What's a requirement? See, to put things in perspective, a requirement, by definition, is something wanted or needed. These are documented and written, and requirements, look at that second bullet point, are capabilities needed to solve a problem. Now let's talk about that. Requirements are capabilities needed to solve a problem. What I see a lot today in a lot of SharePoint implementations, especially those that are not well adopted, organizations, IT people do not look at that and take the approach of solving a problem. It's always that IT model saying, okay, we're IT, we're going to roll out SharePoint, and once it's rolled out, we're going to send out a memo to every single person in the company, here's SharePoint, go forth and prosper. Okay, now if I'm a day-to-day user, I'm a project manager, I'm an HR person, I see this email from IT, use SharePoint. Okay, so what does that mean? In my mind, it's just another technology you're slamming on me, and I don't have time for that. I can't relate to what problem it's going to solve. Even if you tell me it's going to improve collaboration, document management, it still doesn't cut it. Okay, so keep in mind that's what a requirement is. Requirements are not verbal, informal statements or conversations in the hallway. Solutions that state how to solve the problem or meet the objectives. You don't say, oh, yeah, I'm HR and I want a SharePoint site. Well, that's only part of it, but that's not a requirement. And then also, here's another important point. Number 3, it's very important, and we fall into this a lot. Requirements are not characteristics of other systems, other products. Well, how many times have you encountered, especially in the SharePoint project, your customer, management telling you, I don't like how SharePoint looks. Make it look like Ferrari.com or make it look like HawaiianAir.com. That could be a starting point, but that should not be the requirement. So, after learning what requirements are, what's so special about SharePoint? I love this picture. In fact, this picture was drawn by Paul Cumsey. If you guys don't know Paul Cumsey, he's a great SharePoint thinker out of Australia, and he had a presentation with this picture. He says, this sums up SharePoint projects, right? A project manager, a lot of times, not knowing anything about SharePoint, and sometimes they're not even project managers. Hey, you, go roll out SharePoint. Okay, how bad would that be? It's just another Microsoft product, whatever. And then a week into it, 2 weeks into it, suddenly, oh my goodness, what are we going to use this for? These things won't fit. Users don't like it. We try and slam this, that, the other. It's just a nightmare now. However, I still want to deliver it. Man. Because as you can see, look at those pieces. A lot of you mentioned earlier, SharePoint's for collaboration, content management. It's everything, it's nothing, it's something. And the problem is, the approach I've seen a lot today is not sitting down, understanding what problems there are in the organization before trying to solve it with some tool. Just drop the tool there, ain't gonna work. So, what are some of the things you have to look at when you start building requirements for SharePoint projects? I'm talking about some abstract details here. I'll show you a lot of different examples in a while. I'll actually show you some documentation, requirements document, whatnot. But whenever you gather requirements, when you start developing requirements for SharePoint projects, you always have to look at 3 levels of detail, or I would call it the requirements focus. You see business requirements, user requirements, and system requirements. And you have to take this approach because, like I said, a requirement should define what problem we're trying to solve, right? And the only way to define that is at the highest level, the business requirement. And I'll show you an example in a while. And another point I want to raise, if you look at this picture, you got business requirement, arrow pointing down to some user requirement, arrow pointing down to some system requirement. So that system requirement piece should be the last consideration. How many times have you talked to an implementation team or IT? I do this a lot, and I would ask, oh, okay, where's your requirements for your SharePoint projects? And they would just blurt it out easily. Yeah, here's our requirements. We need 2 front-end servers, 1 back-end server, a small farm, this, that, the other. I mean, that's cool, but you're telling me the technical requirements. Prior to figuring that out, you got to understand these higher level requirements and be able to define it. All right, so how do we do that? Here's an example. The first step is you got to define the business need. And oftentimes, like somebody mentioned, users don't know what they want. When I help out organizations rolling out SharePoint, they'll just tell me, Dux, we want SharePoint. And I ask them, why? Dead silence. If I try it again, different language, maybe it'll change. I'll say, ¿por qué? Same thing. And they'll go, what do you mean, why? I go, yeah, you know, SharePoint's cool, but why? Why do you want SharePoint? Why do you think SharePoint will help you? How will it benefit your organization? Let's understand some business needs. So here's an example for you to get you start thinking about building business requirements. So in a recent study, information workers today spend 45 minutes a day searching for information. And I'm sure you would agree with it. You know, on a typical day, your boss asks you, hey, where's that report? Where's that spreadsheet? Oh, let me check my email. Let me check my network share. Oh, maybe it's in John's machine. So that mode of looking for stuff, we spend about 45 minutes a day doing that. And some of you might think, yeah, Dux, I spend more time on that. So analyzing that, in a team of 20 people, that's like 900 minutes a day. In 3 months, that's about 54,000 minutes, or about 37 person days. How much does that cost in time and money? So if I'm paying, you know, an intern, I don't know, $10 for 45 minutes, so I just lost $10 because the intern is wasting 45 minutes a day looking for stuff. But if I had some high-powered consultant sitting in my organization, I'm paying a lot of money and they can't find stuff in my organization. That's a lot of money. So those numbers add up. So what I'm trying to say is when you define a business need, it all boils down to dollars and cents, right? What if search productivity can be increased by 15%? So that's gaining 7 minutes back from that 45 minutes loss. I'm not saying we're going to get the 45 minutes back. So we can make a case, say, well, look, if we buy that 7 minutes back collectively, that's a good chunk of change. So now that's an example of defining a business case. So let's take this forward then. How do we start defining SharePoint requirements based on that business need? So the business need is to improve productivity, okay? So one of the business requirements, because now we know we're going to use SharePoint. My customer told me he wants to use SharePoint. All right, a business requirement would be SharePoint shall increase user productivity by 15%. Now, to some of you, well, Dux, that sounds good, but it's still out there. You know, it's still management speak. How do we make that real? So what you do is you take this business requirement, bring it down to another level called user requirement, and understand how do you deliver that. Okay. So we know there's a lot of ways that SharePoint can increase productivity, but one key ways that SharePoint is really good at is the out-of-the-box search. So So let's talk about search. So we know that you can configure the search 10,000 ways, but one of the things I want to ask a lot of times to customers is if indeed they want to increase their productivity by 15%, saving that 7 minutes, search is important, and I want to find out, for example, how fast or how slow the search results come back. So as a part of that user requirement, I will define a requirement for the search results page. So it might sound something like this. The user shall be able to retrieve search results within 5 seconds of submitting a search request that can support a maximum of 10,000 simultaneous search requests. Okay, folks, listen. This statement right here is very important. So notice that this statement, certainly there's a lot of different pieces, there's a lot of different user requirements, maps directly to supporting this business requirement. Number two, this user requirement, this statement, is bounded clearly. What do you mean, Dux? The search results page, the user shall be able to retrieve, so the search results page will come back within 5 seconds of submitting a search request and can support a maximum of 10,000 simultaneous search. So meaning if there's 10,000 people hit search at the same time, they'll get the results page back within 5 seconds. Anything more than that, it might be a longer time. And why I'm being this specific, or as you write your user requirement, so that there won't be any, so it'll be much clearer. And the third point is, by writing it this way, you've now effectively defined what's called a user acceptance test case. Because the problem a lot of times, when we roll out SharePoint, we don't spend time writing requirements, we just throw it out there. And then users come back and say, how come it doesn't do this? How come it doesn't do that? How come I don't like how it looks? Because you don't have a set of rules defined up front what this thing should be. Whereas if we have a set of rules defined, in this case requirements, so once you roll it out, you're going to tell users, look, these are what we said this thing will do, and we're going to test against these things. So let's try and simulate 10,000 people searching, and let's see how fast or how slow it comes back. Now, if they ask for anything more that you didn't talk about, you didn't define up front, it's cool, but realize that this wasn't part of the project. That's the value of defining requirements. And I'll spend more time on this in a little while. And then third, system requirements. SharePoint server shall have 2 web front ends and a dedicated SQL server which has at least dual processors. Now, for the techies out there, I just made this up. But my point is, based on this user requirement, we can map it down to the kind of technology we need to support that. A lot of times people ask me, hey, Dux, how do you think we should set up our SharePoint environment? Small farm, 2 front ends, 3 front ends, what? I go, what problems are you trying to solve? What are the business needs? I don't know, we just want to throw SharePoint out there. Well, I don't know, right? Because unless you tell me clearly what the business requirements are, that maps to a user requirement, then it's only at that point I can map out or spec out what technical pieces you need. Right? So, what are the key components of requirements development? So I kind of jumped into an example right away because I really want to stress that, look, requirements are not just talking about the technology. Requirements start with what the business needs are, what problems you're trying to solve, and then map it to a series of user requirements. And throughout all of those, you can map it to what the technical requirements are. Next, key components of requirements development. So what I'm showing you here is the 4 phases of requirements development that I go through, or my team goes through, and it's worked really well. And it's not necessarily in this order. It's not a linear order. A lot of times these things happen in what's called iterative fashion or a cyclical fashion, especially if you're practicing what's called the agile methodology in rolling out projects. And I'll talk more about that later. But here are the key components of requirement development. So component number 1 is requirements elicitation. Okay? So let's talk about that. Elicitation is not the same as requirements gathering. Requirements elicitation is gathering and understanding what stakeholders and users need. This is done at an organizational, a business level, at a more detailed user level. So elicitation is the part where you gather business requirement, user requirement. This is a human-based activity. And what I mean by that is, please, do not email a template like a little form to everybody in the organization and say, how do you like your SharePoint? What? Do you like a survey with it? Do you like an announcement? Do you like a document library with it? Let's supersize it with BDC. How about that? No, that does not work. In fact, you do not want to talk about SharePoint when you do requirement solicitation. You engage with the business. So you research, you understand who you're talking to. The next, you read, you educate, and then you observe what people are doing or what people are not doing. So you have to nail it down to the business level context and framework. So here's an example for everybody. Whenever I do requirement solicitation, my team would do it. One of the first things we do is we do what's called an engineering session. And what this is, we educate the business and help them see at a high level what this technology is, but more importantly, tie it to their world. So for example, when I'm in front of HR, I won't start going off on here, SharePoint, click this, click that. I'll start talking about HR. What are some of the processes that you have? They go, what do you mean? HR, you have an onboarding process, right? They go, yeah, of course. So let's talk about that onboarding process. Does it work all the time? They go, what do you mean, Dux? Of course it works all the time. We have an onboarding process. We have a bunch of employees. Okay, has it ever occurred that an employee came in and hanged out for a week because somebody forgot to create a password for them or a table wasn't provisioned for them, etc., etc., etc.? I said, yeah, that happens. So I go, why is that? I thought you guys had an onboarding process. How come a new employee didn't have a table, didn't have a login? Well, because IT forgot to do it. So how do you execute that onboarding process, HR? Well, if somebody wants to hire a new employee, they go to the network share, 18 folders deep, fill out a new employee request form, email it to HR, and then HR approves it, emails it to IT. But if IT drops the ball, then we're in trouble. So that alone, you can highlight a challenge. There's a problem right there, right? So that's what we mean by elicitation, trying to understand existing business situations and looking for problems, and then you're going to tie it on how SharePoint can solve it, right? Now, what's the process? The process is, first off, what do I need to know? Just like that example I gave, depending who you're talking to, are you rolling out SharePoint for the whole organization, for a pilot group, for a specific department, for a project team? Understand that. Understand who the players are. Where do I get this information? Talk to what I suggest, you got to talk to a decision maker, because that decision maker would not only be able to make decisions for you, but they have authority to say, yeah, this is a problem, this is not a problem, etc. Get the information, organize what you know, and then figure out if you have enough information. If not, you might want to talk to somebody else, do another round of discussion, or do some more research. So that's the idea of elicitation. It's not just taking down notes. It's funny, I talk to a customer and say, we don't want to pay for an analyst to come and gather requirements. We have interns here that can interview people. I go, that's the problem. Interviewing people or taking down notes is one thing, but making sense of it, understanding it, mapping it to what technology can do and cannot do is a whole different ballgame. You got to take elicitation seriously. Next, the goal is to build a SharePoint solution. How would you like to drive a Lamborghini Diablo and you just learned how to ride a bike yesterday? And that is the problem we face today in a lot of SharePoint implementations. Again, this nice technology that ever so powerful is just dropped on people's lap. It's like, hey, I'm going to give you a Lamborghini Diablo. You see how all these cool things are, nice features and whatnot? I mean, don't get me wrong, your users would be awed and amazed in the first 10 minutes, and then they'll scratch their head, I don't have time for this. I'm busy enough, I'm short-staffed, I'll just leave it in the garage, and then I'll just ride my bike to work because I know that works. So the goal is not to drop this Lamborghini Diablo in their face, but the goal is to understand what the problems are, and then from those problems be able to build a solution based on SharePoint. Then one more tip for everybody. Do not call your solution SharePoint. What are you talking about, Dux? Because that's another source of confusion. You see, if you're using SharePoint to build an intranet, call it an intranet. If you're using SharePoint to build a human resources onboarding system, call it the HR onboarding system. If you're using it for a project management system, call it a project management system, but do not call it SharePoint. Let me ask you, back in the early 90s, for your very first intranet, you called the thing the Pearl? Have you ever heard people saying, yeah, the information is in the Pearl? Not, right? So the same idea, SharePoint is a platform. It's like water. It's like Pearl. It's like all these technologies. You can use it to build solutions. So do not call it SharePoint. Now, next step is understanding and analyzing what you've elicited. So after you've elicited information, so you've gathered and made sense of it, the next step is to analyze it. And what is requirements analysis? Requirements analysis takes the elicited information and you want to make sense of it. And in order to do this effectively, the person doing this, you, the expert, who have gathered the information, you got to understand, first of all, what the business needs are, but you got to have a good sense of what the technology can do and cannot do. I'm not saying that you have to be really, a very heavy technical SharePoint person. You can code and whatnot. No. But if you have a good understanding of all the capabilities and try and map it to the business needs, then that's what we mean by analysis. And what's the process of analysis? The first step is, first of all, to profile users. I'm going to give you a bunch of examples. So in a recent project, and I'm sure you would sympathize with me. So we're rolling out SharePoint for a large organization, different groups of people, and I spent time with the executives. So I've gathered elicited all their needs, all their business needs, and obviously, as you would suspect, on top of the list, they want a dashboard, right? That's a secret to folks I haven't met. If you want to get promoted, use the word dashboard, right? So the executives, they want dashboard. Okay, cool. So based on their needs, because they need to measure sales, finance information, and project schedule, whatnot. So I was thinking about that, and I was mapping it to SharePoint. There's 10,000 ways of doing it. But one of the key things around these users, your executives, first of all, are busy. They don't have time and patience to learn new things. And they're really, really attracted to nice-looking dashboards. So I took note of that. Now, for a different set of users, let's say your day-to-day finance people or HR people, they couldn't care less about dashboards, but they might be heavy Excel users, like finance people. I don't know about you, but every financial person I meet in an organization, Excel is like their only tool, right? So they're big on Excel. So you want to profile them and understand where they're coming from, and you don't want to rock the boat too much when you build a solution, because you want to make sure it gets adopted. It's funny, I had a question the other day. Somebody was saying, well, Docs, how far do you do custom dev in SharePoint? I mean, it's out of the box, but people just have to learn a new way of doing things. Well, my answer to that is it depends who that person is, right? If it's a high-powered executive, let's say Bill Gates. Let's say if Bill Gates never saw SharePoint and he had to learn how to use SharePoint versus doing it his own way and then we custom code it. Personally, I would say custom code it because the time that Bill Gates would spend learning SharePoint would cost more than custom coding a little widget for Bill Gates. And I'm not saying that's the answer, but my point is you got to understand who your users are. Number two, you got to model stated requirements. One of the things that I'm sure you have seen is a lot of times what people tell you, stated requirements, are not the real requirements. Because here's a common example. A common quote-unquote requirement I get is people don't like how SharePoint looks. They would say, I don't like how it looks. Make it not look like SharePoint. All right, that's fine. But what they don't understand is they're comparing SharePoint with existing web technologies. It's like apples and oranges. Not to set the wrong expectation, if you want to drastically change how SharePoint looks, it's very, very hard. You have to be an expert to do this. I'm not an expert. I mean, I can tweak little things here and there, but to make it look like not SharePoint, it's hard. And the way to do that is you can model it. I mean, there's the beauty with SharePoint. It's very flexible platform that you can just fire up a sample environment, fire up SharePoint Designer if you have that tool, and say, look, it's not easy, it's hard. Then at that point when I do that, people will go, well, why do we want to use SharePoint if it's so hard to make it look pretty? Then I come back and say, well, yeah, it's kind of hard to custom brand SharePoint, but let's talk about what your priorities are. First of all, is the priority of this solution making it look pretty? If it's a public-facing site, it has to be really pretty, then fine. We'll have to get the right resources for that. But second, going back to your question about if it's so hard to make it look pretty, why do we want to use SharePoint? What about this? The flip side of SharePoint is for all the other pieces, it's very powerful. Imagine being able to create a site that people can log in, upload stuff, connect it to Office. You could do all that in like 5 minutes out of the box. Can PHP do that? So what you want to do is stress the point that SharePoint is a different technology. And then number 3, part of your analysis is you want to do some kind of gap analysis. So for example, after you've profiled your users, your executives, for example, and then you model the executives and say, look, making it look hard or making it look pretty is very hard. And the gap that you have right now is A, you don't have a resource that can really do SharePoint branding, and B, you don't have the right sets of, I don't know, information yet to perform your dashboard. And my point right there is, I was with an executive and they said, we want a dashboard, red, yellow, green. And I told them, well, before we talk about that, let's understand your metrics and process. They say, we don't have time for that. All right, so you want red, yellow, green. What does red mean? Everybody said, when it's late. Okay, there's like 5 of them there. And I go, what do you mean by late? One guy says 2 weeks. The other person says 5 months. The other says 2 months. That's a gap right there, right? You're asking for all this stuff, but the fundamental idea of what these things mean is not there. So that's a gap. We got to figure that out. Then to identify the real requirement. So you can see this is a iterative, a circular process. You go back and forth, because after I figure out there's a bunch of gaps, I go and elicit more information. Okay, who do I ask about your metrics? What group do I work with to understand how you define information, how you tag information? So then we're going to identify the real requirements. And once you do that, here's another way to model your requirements. One of the things I do a lot, other than using SharePoint itself, SharePoint Designer, is I do a process flow. I don't know, for folks that's not familiar with this, what this is after user define their requirements, this is an example of a project we did for an event management system using SharePoint. It says we want the event management system to do this, that, the other, because it solves that problem, this, that, the other. So we process flowed it. We said, okay, when a new event is added, what happens? So in the beauty of doing this process flow, we found a lot of gaps in here. There's missing pieces that we're able to fill in, and then once we're done, we're able to identify the real requirements. So that's one way. Another way of being able to effectively analyze your requirements, folks, I'm going to flip my screen here because I want to share a template that I use a lot. I'm sure some of you have seen this already, but here a template that I use to analysis. And in fact, I use this with my customers. Did I see this? Okay. Coming up. Okay, so everybody should see an Excel template. So one of the things that that I do during elicitation and analysis is, first of all, when I do elicitation, I talk to different groups. So look at this spreadsheet here. So in this case, it's the operations department, HR department, finance department. So one of the things that I do is I understand the problems that they have. So as I poke around, for example, operations, they have problems with SOP creation, doing departmental orders, performance evaluation, whatever. But in the back of my mind, I map these. I don't show this to them, but I map this to SharePoint capabilities, document management, workflow, auditing, whatever, and I put some. So after I do all this stuff, when I do my analysis of what all this means, so I kind of reorganize this with the different departments, and then I take these different capabilities of SharePoint and just list it, what capabilities of SharePoint are needed, list, document management, process, BI, whatever. And I measure these things because this helps me with my analysis. The colors, by the way, would mean the phases, like this pink means this is for phase 1, we're going to do this, we're going to do that the second, and I'll explain more of that in a while. And then there's different areas I try and measure, and I work with the customer to measure this. By the way, these numbers mean something, right? So it's not just numbers. So for example, just by looking at these different problems or challenges that departments have, another thing I would do during elicitation is, okay, operations, you've got all these challenges that you'd like fixed or improved upon. I'd like you to prioritize it. If you can prioritize these things, please do it for me. And based on those priorities, I map it back to the priority based on the feature. And I do this because I want to find out what common features are evident across the board so I can make a case on which should go out first, which shouldn't go out first. So I do that, what the priority is, what the size of effort would be, low, medium, high, meaning these numbers mean, well, that feature, to roll out that feature, would require 20 hours of an expert SharePoint, whatever. 3-person weeks, etc. Right? And what's the impact and how reusable it is, and then what the total value is. Okay? And the reason why I do this is I go across the organization now, and looking at the value, I can prioritize what, in my mind, based on the requirements I've gathered, should be deployed first, should be deployed next. So that's one piece. This is analyzing the business needs and mapping it to SharePoint capabilities. The next piece, which a lot of people fail to do, is analyzing IT capability. Because it's one thing if you hire a consultant to roll out SharePoint for your organization. And then once the consultant leaves, who's going to take care of that, right? So I help analyze and assess, based on these feature set, what can IT do and cannot do? What's the impact to IT? So for example, it means that it requires more resources for IT. What's the support impact? Well, the support impact is 20 hours per week for IT to support that. What's the training impact? What's the cost? Then I'll have a total impact for IT, so I can tell the customer, this is what it means to roll out SharePoint if I do it for you, or my organization will do it for you. But this is what it means for IT to keep it and take care of it. So are you up for that? Right? So I use these tools to help analyze and understand what the gaps are and what's realistic and what's not realistic. Okay? You guys hear me? Sorry, I've been going on and on. Ryan has lost audio. Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you, Dux. We can hear you fine. I'll talk to Ryan.
Okay, great. Just feel free to stop me if I get in the zone. I keep on talking here. Okay. Great. So, and I see a lot of great questions. I'll address all that in a while. So after I've analyzed it, one of the things that you often find out is that you can't do it all. Because now the customers tell you one thing, you've analyzed it, you found gaps, you added more requirements. The next step is requirements validation. And the process of validation is prioritizing what you're going to do and what you're not going to do. Okay? So it's essential to identify what it will take to deploy SharePoint, what it will take in terms of resources, in terms of time, and skill sets. And it goes back to a fundamental project management rule. You got to ask your customer, you always have to throw it back to your customer or management, what's important for you? Because oftentimes customers or management will come to you and say, oh, you're the Windows admin, now I bless you as the SharePoint admin. I want you to roll out SharePoint in 3 months for 500 people. All by yourself, on top of everything else you're doing. Well, that's not realistic, right? So after you do all this homework, you got to go back now and say, look, this is what I found. I found that HR has all these needs, operations has all that needs, these are the priorities, this is what it needs. So if the priority is to deploy it in 3 months, then I need a full team to help me with this. And more importantly, IT has to be ready once it's out to take care of it. That's what it means. Is that the priority, boss? Time? Or is a priority that you just need something out there, but you don't have enough money to hire a full team or a big set of people to deploy it? I only have you, Joey, to take care of this for me. Okay, well, I have my day job as a Windows admin, and you want me to do all this stuff. It's going to take me a year. Look at this list. So you got to stop and talk to your business owners or your executives who wants this done. Look, what's important to you? Let's be realistic. Right? Mark, I'll get back to you on that. Hold that thought. Hold that thought. Okay? So, and you do validation along with the customer. So here's another example. So one of the tip I have for you, anytime somebody tells you, hey, roll out SharePoint, be it at an organizational level or a department level, is what's called an assessment. And pretty much this is all the requirements in here. I always tell the customer, look, depending how big or how small they are, I'm going to spend a week, 2 days, 3 days, 2 weeks, whatever, to assess what your needs are. And assessing really is understanding the business requirements. In a lot of cases, specking out the user technical piece. As a result of this assessment, my deliverable typically would be that Excel file you saw, what the priorities are, and number 2 is the next step of what the game plan should be. Well, customers, since your priority is to have a HR onboarding system before the year ends and you only have this much money, this is the approach that you should have before you do anything. Derek, can we get a copy of the templates? Absolutely. All the templates I'm showing here, I'll give it to you. Just don't sell it, all right? And don't pass it around and claim it, it's yours. But most certainly, all these templates I'm showing you, I'll give you a copy. Okay. Now, so I spent time doing assessment. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You're like, well, Dux, management won't buy that, right? And I've been in that situation. I talk to customers and I tell them, look, this is my approach. They're like, we're not paying for that. I'm hiring you, Dux, and your team because I just want you to do it. And I know this is a lame analogy, but what I always say is, first of all, I don't roll like that. And second, I always ask, look, the tallest skyscraper in the world, nobody decided one day to buy a piece of land, go to Home Depot, buy all these parts, and start building, in their minds, the tallest skyscraper in the world. They spent a chunk of time to figure out what this tall skyscraper would be, how many floors you're going to have, what kind of people it's going to support, what kind of businesses they'll have. They spent a lot of time understanding what these requirements are before even they went building it. That's the same approach that you should take with SharePoint. And people aren't buying that because at the end of the day, a lot of folks do not understand SharePoint. And that's why up front I said during elicitation, you got to educate folks that SharePoint is a platform. Now, after you spend time doing elicitation, analysis, and validation, you got to put it on paper. You got to put it on paper, right? And what I mean by putting it on paper, after all this talk, informal templates and spreadsheets being passed around, you got to generate a requirements document because this formally communicates the quantitative and qualitative characteristics. And this also defines the functionality of the desired end result or outcome. I mean, think about this. If your requirements document would have all your requirement statement, at least for this phase of the project, well, the search results should come back in no more than 5 seconds that supports 10,000 users. You can take that once the platform or whatever solution you're building is done and go back to those list of things and test it against those. So this requirements document not only would have your requirement statement, it's your process diagrams, your traceability matrix as well. Now, let me quickly define what traceability matrix is for those not familiar. What traceability matrix is you should be able to trace each requirement back to a source business requirement. What do I mean by that? If during the project I saw, one of my key team member buying 2 servers to be used as a web front end for SharePoint, if I asked them, why are you buying 2 web front end or 2 Dell boxes to be the web front ends? That person should be able to look up, well, I'm buying these 2 things because it's a system requirement that supports user requirement 1, 2, 3, that supports business requirement 1. That's what we mean by our traceability matrix. It should be able to question every single thing people are doing in the project, and it should go back to the business need you're trying to solve. Now, before I talk about the next piece, I want to show you an example. Let me show you an example of a requirements document. And like I said, I'll give everybody a copy of this. I want to show you a sample requirements document. I kind of sanitized it already. A requirements document for an intranet, SharePoint intranet project. Give me a second. Everybody's seeing? Okay. So, there you go. So this is an example of an intranet project for a requirements document. So way back when. So again, there's no definite template, but this is the kind of template we use. We got objectives, a success criteria, whatever. Business requirements, okay. Functional requirements. What else do I have? Go all the way down. Yeah, so these are all the functional requirements, and notice how it outlines all the different things. And keep in mind, I haven't said this yet, but requirements change. You know, people's minds change, which is cool, and you just have to have a way to manage it, and this is some change management process. That's a sample requirement document. In essence, you should include these things. Now, in your requirements document, I just want to share a couple last tips before I go for Q&A. What makes a great requirement? So, I'm a person of simplicity, straight to the point, practicality. Every time you write a requirement document, content should be there, the right structure should be there, so it's readable. And here's a structure that I propose for you, and I've been using this. It's simple. Whenever you write a requirement statement, be it a business requirement, user requirement, or system, you should have these components. Subject shall be able to some capability within some criteria. If you don't put that criterion, that means your requirement is going to happen 100% of the time, all right? So subject shall be able to whatever capability. If you don't put a criterion, it's going to happen all the time. So let me show you the example. We talked about this. We talked about earlier, and then we'll go back to this again. So this is the example I had in the first few slides where I talked about business requirement, user requirement. SharePoint shall increase user productivity by 15%. SharePoint is a subject. Increase user productivity, capability, 15% is a criterion. And I know some of you, this sounds hokey, it's high level. That's fine. It's a business requirement. In order to do that, there's a lot of things you can do. One of the things we can do is obviously define how search would work. And one of the components of search is search results. And as a search result user requirement, when the user gets the search results, the user, subject, shall be able to retrieve search results, capability, within 5 seconds of submitting a search request. That can support a maximum of 10,000 simultaneous search requests. Criterion. And again, I'm not being obsessive compulsive about this. The reason why that's there is so it's clear. Because a lot of times when I ask my customers, so how fast do you want a search results to come back? They'll say, very fast. And then I poke into, what do you mean by very fast? And then they'll tell me, what do you think, Dux? You're the expert. Well, I go, industry standard, 5 seconds is fine. Then they'll be fine with that. And you have to have that discussion so that you won't have the idea that users don't know what they want. Because reality is, users don't know what they want. It's your job to help figure out what they want. And lastly, system requirements, same thing. So here's a tip for you. Use this structure to write your requirement statement. Here's a sample requirements document I showed you. And pretty much that sums up of what I wanted to talk to you about today. Really, first of all, requirements are important. Look at 3 areas. Got to understand what the business needs are. Your boss telling you roll out SharePoint doesn't cut it. You got to poke and poke and poke. Once you have these business needs, nail it down to, okay, looking at the business needs, tying it to a SharePoint solution, identify user requirements. Things like how fast the response would be. What kind of logins do we need? Do we have external people, internal people? Because that would define if we're going to use Windows authentication, FBA, whatever. After you've defined your user requirements, then you can spec out your system requirements to support those user requirements, to support those business requirements. And then the whole process of doing all this is elicitation, is gathering and understanding what people need or want, and do this a bunch of times. Based on what you've elicited, you got to analyze. You got to make sense of it. Are there any gaps, right? So that spreadsheet I showed you helped me a lot. Now, once you've narrowed it down and figured out the real requirements, now you got to validate and prioritize. When do you stop, right? Too legit to quit. Stop when you've got a list of priorities and you go back to the customer and say, okay, what's important to you? The customer will say, I want to have it all. Okay, it's going to cost this much time and this much money. We can't do that. I only have $10. Okay, $10 can only buy you the top 2 requirements. And then document it and then go and do it. Right? So hopefully this was beneficial to everybody. It made sense. Like I said, I'll provide all the templates to you. Expect an email from Catherine. I'll give you all the links to these resources. These are my contact info if you have any other questions. And if you guys don't mind, leave a feedback on that link. I'd highly appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and address some of the questions here, and feel free to jump in if you have other questions. Gary's question. Let's say, sorry, Catherine, I've been moving this pot around. Let's say a company has decided to use SharePoint as a repository. Now it's a mess finding information. Beyond hiring a librarian, how can we fix this or refactor sites and make it useful? Gary, very good question. The first thing you got to do is you got to find a sponsor. What I mean by a sponsor is a decision maker higher up that would buy into this idea of redoing it, because redoing it, it's going to cost a lot of time, not a lot of time, but it's going to cost time and money. And number 2 is, how do you redo it? There's a lot of different techniques of doing it. You can start over, you can fix, what you have. There's a lot of resources out there to do it. But for the purposes of this discussion, you got to get an executive sponsor who's going to buy into this idea of addressing the issue, because there's business value in it. If there's no business value, then there's no point. Number 2 is you got to spend time doing assessment, just like what I showed you earlier. You got to understand, what do you mean by fixing it? What do you mean by not finding it? Other than being a repository, there's a whole lot more you could do with SharePoint. Maybe understand what the business needs are and provide other solutions. Stacy's question. I project manage and consult several collaboration site launch using SharePoint. Interested how regulatory agencies are inspecting these sites. Is there any learning that can be shared? We are a pharma company. Managing regulated content is a challenge. Very good, Stacy. To answer your question, SharePoint has been used in a lot of highly compliant environment. We work with pharmaceuticals and healthcare institutions. There are certain things you could do with SharePoint quickly. For example, turn on version control. If you have to subscribe to HIPAA, Sarbanes-Oxley, or FDA Part 11, version control alone is big. Check in, check out. There's other things you can do through document workspaces. But draw me an email, Stacy. I can give you some more ideas. Somebody's asking, do you recommend using SharePoint as a high-fidelity, public-facing website? Absolutely, but I want to preface that with, again, what business need are you trying to solve? It doesn't mean that you could do it, you want to go for it. I want to give you quick examples. Hawaiian Air, Ferrari, a lot of high-profile sites are using SharePoint, not because it's cool, it's cool, but they're using it as a public-facing site because the data interaction they have from the public-facing site, guess what, interacts with their internal data, which is also in SharePoint. Now, there's a business value right there. Instead of having 2 disparate systems, one for the public-facing site, one for internal, they're using the same thing where it's just a different view in the outside and different view in the inside. So, yeah, SharePoint can be done for a public-facing site, but, again, what business need or business value you're trying to provide. Can SharePoint be used as an easy way for non-technical users? Absolutely. Filter from a database? Absolutely. There's Audrey, go and look up. There's a lot of resources out there on how you leverage SharePoint. You can tie it to Excel. You can tie it to MySQL, Oracle. Let's see. Can you describe the columns on that worksheet again, Dean? I have a full blog post on that worksheet I use, so I'll provide that to you as well, so you can have more deep dive on that. Mark, how do you come up with requirements like 5 seconds, 10,000 transactions? Very often I see these coming out of someone's 4th point of contact or brainstorming session and become real even though they are not based on anything but thin air. I agree with you, Mark. Very good point. So let's go back to my business need. First of all, how did I figure out 45 minutes? People waste 45 minutes. Well, first of all, there's industry research on that. But second, if you want to measure it yourself, there are tools that you can install for the whole organization, that can monitor people's activity. And you could do that for a sample of 100 people and maybe for a week. It can tell you how often the mouse cursor moved or what's the frequency of the mouse moving around. And by doing that, you'll know what people are doing. So you can get numbers. So that's a business requirement level. The next step, user requirement. How do you come up with like 5 seconds, 10,000 transactions? Well, quite simply. So the business requirement was to increase 15% or to save 7 minutes. You could do the math. Say, what does saving 7 minutes mean? How can you do that? Well, part of the thing, when somebody searches for information, that time between the search and the results coming back, that's some time. So if you want to gain 15% back, so I want to make sure that thing is not really slow. So it could be 5 seconds, it could be 10 seconds. I use 5 seconds because that's some industry standards for search results coming back. Now, what about 10,000 transactions? 10,000 transactions, that's a customer requirement. One of the customers I work with literally sent that, look, we're a 1,000 people organization. At a given point in time, there could be 10,000 queries against the search. It's a customer requirement. So based on those requirements, unless SharePoint can't do it, then that's a problem. But based on those requirements, now I can map it to SharePoint as a technology. In order to fulfill that, I have to have this powerful server, SQL server set up this way, how much RAM I have. So my point, Mark, is you can come up with these requirements, again, mapping it from the business requirement. But the point is, too, is you got to measure it once it's done. I see a lot of people out there come up with these measurements, but once it's done, they don't go back and test it and measure if they met those requirements. Okay, I want to address one more question because we're kind of out of time here. Dean, do you have a list of requirement elements that map to SharePoint 2010 feature? I'm thinking specifically of planning for managed metadata and taxonomy. Nothing that's specific, Dean, but I'll put together some resources that I've come across that can point you to that direction. All right, Mario, can you use SharePoint integrated with databases? Absolutely. You can stick it to any industry standard tool. SharePoint is the most open source Microsoft product out there. So anyway, Catherine, you got to stop me here. I know
You're on a roll, Dux. How can I stop you?
Oh, but hopefully this was beneficial to everybody, and you know, this is one of the things that people don't focus on and look at. I mean, the technology is great, but people don't talk about and spend time what it takes to make organizations successful. Because at the end of the day, we're all excited about SharePoint, but it's a tool. Your end users couldn't care less. If it doesn't help them save time, save money, make their life better, SharePoint will suck for them, and you don't want that to happen. With that being said, thanks again for joining us today, and this will be recorded, and I look forward to hearing from you or having you join me in the next webcast with Joel Olesen.
And that's on August 20th, and what is the title again, Dux?
The title is Best Practices in Migrating and Upgrading to SharePoint 2010. So Joel has a great presentation on that, and I've done a couple of 2010 migrations, so we can join forces and share our tips and tricks.
Okay, and I think we have another good one coming up in September, too. And as I said, those are on our webcast page, so be sure you can go ahead and sign up now, and you'll get a reminder as they come up, because you won't want to miss them. And Dux, thank you. It's always a pleasure. You know how much I enjoy your webcasts. They're I won't use the awesome word, but they're great. And I also, while everyone's here, I want to let you know we have another good webcast tomorrow that you might want to check out. It's not SharePoint related or anything close, but it's I've seen the presentation. It's the upside of downtime, and it's about what to do, what your company should do, or how you should handle it when you guys have some kind of downtime or a disastrous PR event. Very informative, so, and kind of fun. So if you have the time, I recommend that you join us tomorrow. And Dux, I'm looking forward to having you back. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone.
You're so welcome. Thank you.